Welcome to part two of my interview with Keeper Trout. We're going to be talking about peyote conservation in the Americas, predominantly in Texas and Mexico, or peyote in its natural habitat. So let's get back into the interview now. I know the topic of peyote conservation is very complicated and lots of different people see it from different perspectives. But I did want to ask, what is your vision of peyote conservation?
Well, see, this is where we actually have a problem because conserving cactus is sort of delusional. What we really need to be conserving is cactus habitat, because it's like, yeah, we can conserve cactus in a pot on our shelves, but that doesn't really do much for what's in nature and it doesn't do much for the actual state of the organisms. And I'm not saying there's anything bad with that, but it's not the same thing as trying to preserve habitat, trying to find places where, land can be set aside and not used, not developed, not even harvested from. And like with Lophophora, that becomes tricky because, due to the shortages, if there is any Lophophora, people want to know where it is so it can be picked. And I understand that, but at the same time, it's one of these problematic pictures where there's gosh, I'm trying to remember, it's Gareth something wrote this really interesting account called Tragedy of the Commons. And this is one of the problems that we're facing with peyote is from everybody's point of view, what they're doing and what they're taking is really small. But when it adds up with all of, the hundreds of thousands of users of legal people whose use of peyote is protected by law, um, the impact that that's having on Texas populations is really quite horrific. And because it's inadequate for fulfilling what they need, the interests have moved into getting Mexican peyote for U.S. use, even though it shouldn't be legal or legitimate because Mexican peyote people, they need their peyote too. And this idea that just because we're here in the U.S. and we want peyote, um, Mexican people should be willing to share their peyote. Um, it's it's this is the biggest challenge that we have right now because the Native American church is sort of backed into a corner, and that there's a lot of very vocal people who are 100% dead set against peyote being cultivated because they believe that it shows a lack of faith in the peyote's ability to take care of itself. And there's a problem with this thinking because it's magical thinking. And I could engage in some magical thinking too in this case. And you might have even heard me say this before, but I'll say it again because I believe it. I believe the peyote is powerful enough to take care of itself. And I believe the way it does so is it seeks out people like me or Martin Terry or Blake Williams because we have brains, we have eyes, we have mouths, we have the ability to speak, we have the ability to write, we have hands, we have feet. We can do all types of work on peyote's benefit that the plant cannot do. And so people can say what they want about me being a white man having an interest in peyote, which I do not consume, but they can say what they want. I know what I'm doing is the right thing because I was asked for this in the very beginning of the 1990s, which is when I stopped eating peyote and promised the plant that I would work on its behalf to be sure it's here longer than our species is. And of course, the tricky part of this is because Native American, well, members of any entity who are recognized by the federal government for being what's for qualifying for federal assistance, namely people who are members of a federally recognized tribe, pueblo, group, entity, etc. Every one of those people has a constitutional right from a constitutional amendment, it's actually not constitution, it's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's a congressional act. It's not constitutional. It's a congressional action. But it gave them the right to eat, transport, and even cultivate peyote if that's what they're wanting to do with it. And so any picture involving conservation of peyote has to work with the fact that there are, according to their numbers, 468,000 individuals in the United States who have the right to consume peyote legally. And so if that's not factored into conservation plans, those conservation plans will fail because those people have legal right. They actually have the legal right to eat it down to the last one if that's what they chose to do. The law doesn't say a thing about conservation or about how harvesting should occur. And so all we can do is try to do good research so people can make their own decisions because, we can't tell other people what to do. I certainly don't have the wisdom to tell anybody how to practice their religion. It's just, but at the same time, if you look at the reported sales of peyote, it's never gotten above around, I think, 2.6 million plants per year. Sounds like a lot, but when you consider there's 468,000 Native American church members, that's Native American church, not just peyote using groups, because there's actually more people using peyote, but just within that one umbrella organization called the NAC, there's close to 500,000. And the smaller subset they interviewed about individual use, we don't know if it's representative of all of them or not. But the smaller subset they interviewed, they're saying that they eat peyote over 50 times a year. And so when you got 500,000 people eating peyote, potentially up to 500,000 times a year, up to 50 or more times a year, and they're eating anywhere from 1 to 8 to 13 buttons, we're talking a lot of plants. And that 2.6 million, or now, like around 1 million, that's trivial as far as what's being consumed. And so very clearly, for a very long time, there's been an invisible flow of peyote that's been coming to Native American church, which is legal. Any Native American church member, if they have landowner permission, they themselves can go on that land and harvest peyote, for themselves or for their group. And it's completely legal and legitimate, but it has no paper trail. And so it's an invisible system of harvesting that has been happening in parallel with the distributors. But if you think about those numbers, very clearly, wild harvesting has limits, even if it's done conservatively, because, we don't know the exact number, but we know it's greater than 8 years for sustainable harvesting from harvest to harvest. Our study site got poached after 8 years, so we were unable to actually establish whether or not that's the true inflection point, but we know it's at least 8 years. So we know that. And so you have this picture of the slow growing plant. And if you're cultivating it, you're going to have to be having seedlings going while you're, once you got adult plants to harvest, you still have to be planting seedlings because each year is going to be needing more harvest. At some point, new growth can take over. But starting out, there's this long lag time of what's going to be required for getting something up and going. And satisfying that with that many people and users and plants is an actually huge undertaking. IPCI is doing a great thing with what they're trying to do. Um, and I've been jumped on for what I'm about to say, but I'll say it again. Um, and I don't mean this to put down IPCI in any way, but with their plans of growing like 1 million or 2 million plants in terms of their production and putting that out there, that's fantastic. But we need 50 more of those organizations. The ideal thing would be decentralized production where every possible Native American church chapter that could cultivate, if they were cultivating, this could overcome this challenge, within the next decade or two. But this is one of our challenges. We don't have the numbers. We don't, and now it's gotten even worse. It used to be that the Texas Department of Public Safety was in charge of the peyote distributors, and they kept the records, and it was all a matter of public record. Some years ago, DEA took this over. Now, it's not a matter of public record anymore. We can't find out how many peyotes have been sold. We can't even find out how many peyote distributors there are. A friend had contacted DEA to try to get this information through a Freedom of Information Act request. And they were saying, wow, that's a really unusual question. We're going to have to be doing a lot of research to come up with that. So you're going to have to be patient, and we'll get back to you. And then when they got back to him, it was like, you're just wasting our time. You're asking us for information, but you did not cite the case law giving us the authority to regulate the activities that you're asking about. So just piss off. They didn't say piss off, but that was but they basically just blew him off. And so with this being the picture where we don't have access to knowledge about what's actually occurring, there's no real way of resolving that one. It's all we can do is keep pushing forward and, trying to secure more conservation easements wherever we can. Try to promote cultivation wherever we can. And if people like, and forgive, I hope I don't offend these two people by saying these names, but if people like David Bronner and Michael Pollan would not buy the emperor's new clothes and believe cultivation is a bad thing, cultivation is the only thing that works for plants that have huge human pressures. When you have close to 500,000 people drawing out of the wild on a plant that is not cultivated, there is an end to that process. And what we're seeing, with peyote, we've seen with fish, we've seen it with ginseng. Initially the numbers go up, but the sizes of the individuals go down. So the actual total biomass is decreased. And this is what happens with any natural resource that's leaned on too heavily. And that's what's happened to peyote. And the fact that it's now largely moved into being a Mexican operation in terms of feeding the US, that's only kicking the can down the road. It's just, I have hope that what IPCI is going to do is going to be a living example that will encourage people to start doing something similar. And so I wish them nothing but success. It's just a hard road no matter how people go down it, because we're talking about a religious organization that's not actually an organization. The Native American Church is, I'm not sure exactly how many chapters, but it looks like it's in excess of 260, each one of which is separately incorporated, each one of which has their own membership requirements, their own charter, their own bylaws. each one of them is an individual organization. So when people think about Native American church, they think this is an entity, but it's actually an umbrella term that incorporates um, several hundred entities. And the philosophical beliefs range from like traditional pre-Christian, you know, pagan religion to fundamentalist uh, Protestant Christians and everything in between. And so it's this very complex dynamic because you're dealing with a lot of different people, some of which don't even get along with each other. And so to try to push everybody together and make them one big and treat it like it's one big happy family that's going to all work it out really doesn't have much of a historical picture of the people who are involved. And that's why my personal belief is that all of the people involved should be empowered at as local of a level as possible, because that's where the answer is. If one thing I've noticed, when people actually grow peyote and say they've got this plant that they started from seed and it's been in their possession for like 25 years or 30 years, I don't see many people eating those plants. I mean, the notion of eating that plant would be like saying, "Hey, why don't you eat your daughter? She'd make a great barbecue." It would be just as appalling and abhorrent to many people to suggest that, they should be sacrificing these plants that they've been watching grow. And I personally believe this is one of the benefits of cultivation, is because it gives people appreciation for the plant as a plant. If you look at it as a living being, then it actually has a future, because there are things that we all need, as living organisms. And peyote is the same thing. Peyote doesn't exist here for us to eat. That's not its purpose for being on the planet. Peyote is here for its own purposes. It's here to, in my opinion, the reason peyote is here is to live, flower, drop seeds, and grow more peyote. And that's what we should be encouraging it to do.
I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the project that you're working on with Anya Makova.
But it's her project. We're all helping. And what she's looking at is population density. And so, and how she did this is she laid out a transect, which essentially is a straight line. I mean, duh. And but the transect we actually used steel wire, and like ran it through all of our plants. Um, she's doing something that's more statistically valid and reproducible, where she basically laid transects on several properties. And how they were laid was that on each end of the line, there's a nail in the ground. And so you go there, you find the nail, and then you line up between the two. And I think it's 1 meter on each side. You count the plants. And of course, all the plants we have numbered tags so that we know that we're looking at and measuring the same plants. But then we also, if there's new plants, like new seedlings, or something that maybe was buried on the previous trip where somebody didn't see it, those will then get added into the spreadsheet also, and they'll be given their own nail and tag. So each year the number sort of goes up. But what it's looking at is, recruitment of seedlings, survival, and growth rates. It's actually a study of population density on several different locations throughout the several Texas counties. And so it's exciting stuff because it's actually looking at what's, the dynamic elements within a population and its growth and health. Um, I mean, stepping aside, something I found, horrifying and interesting both. We went to this nature preserve to do one of the transects. And what we found is all of the land around it had been bulldozed flat. It's like all the brush was gone, all the cactus was basically just sort of scraped clean. Somebody had bought like a huge parcel of land and they'd subdivided it into tiny parcels of probably like 1 acre, 2 acres, 5 acres, put up some fancy house on it, and basically created a subdivision, completely destroying all of the life that was there. And one of those life forms is star cactus, which is, one of the rarest cactus in the US. And even though it's federally protected, this is a real good example that federal protection of any plant will not slow or stop development. If it's money versus a plant, the plant will always lose. And that's what we saw there. But Anya's study is really exciting because it gives us a tool to actually statistically look at what's happening with the populations just by going back and recording new data year after year. So I'm excited to see where that one goes.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about the peyote's life cycle? In Australia, I've unfortunately not had the privilege of seeing it in its natural habitat. So I'd love to know a little bit more about its life cycle.
It can flower within 5 years. Depending on how you approach it, it can flower even sooner, especially if you're treating it right or doing grafting. But to actually get it up to where it's of a harvestable size and potency is typically 12 to 16 years from seed. And then regrowth after cutting is at least 8. Because what people notice is, you cut off the top and suddenly you got, instead of 1 crown, you got 3 crowns, or you got 5 crowns. And so it looks like you've actually increased it. But it's not until years later that the biomass actually catches up with the original biomass. And that's what people miss, is that yes, you have more, but they're much, much smaller, and they're much weaker, and in terms of alkaloid content. And no matter what people want to say about, this being a reductionist idea, it is about the alkaloids. Because if it wasn't, people wouldn't need to be eating peyote. They could be holding a rock in their hand. If it was entirely just a matter of faith, they wouldn't need to be ingesting a thing.
Are you able to take me through a couple of different bits of information around harvesting? It's not something like, as in, because you've said that your own site was harvested. So how bad can that look? Is there is there a sustainable harvesting to some degree? There's a moderately, negative, and then there's terrible. What are you doing?
Ours was terrible. I mean, they didn't just take every single plant. Some of them, we couldn't even find roots. We couldn't even find like bases left in the ground. And it was actually even worse than that. They're surrounded by a plant known as blackbrush, Acacia rigidula, or now it's what is it? Vachellia rigidula. And it's really spiny and thorny. And so if you're out, like working with peyote, taking measurements, getting photographs, your forearms and hands look like you've been fighting with cats, where this like pokes and rips, and it's just, your shirt soaked with blood and you're just punctured all over. That's just part of working with it. What the poachers, who I'm told I should be calling fence jumpers rather than poachers, because it's rude for me to call them poachers. But fence jumpers or poachers, whatever you want to call them, it's the same activity. And this comes back to what we were talking about before with this cyclical harvesting. If you don't know when the last time a field was harvested, you don't know that it's been given long enough. So you could be going back in there and actually taking a second harvest too soon before the plant has had time to recover its stored food. because until it regrows a new crown, it's reliant on its foodstuffs that are stored in its root or in the subterranean stem. And so this is one of the challenges, is that if it's harvested too frequently, the mortality rate goes up. Now, what we found is when we got there, we couldn't find the entrance to our site initially. And the reason is because people had gone in and they had chopped out all the nurse plants so that they didn't have to fight through the thorns. So they actually removed the cover that would help the peyote recover. And so instead of being grown in this nice dappled shade and sun like it normally is, now those areas are full sun. So what we saw there was very disrespectful. I mean, it was actually murderous. I mean, there's very little other way to view it than just outright murderous in terms
And
of so it's just, yeah, it's just, and we could not find any distributor that would permit us to follow behind their people and tag plants and study the mortality. Zero. We actually had to find a roadman who led us. He basically, in the area he was permitted to collect from, he let us harvest in an area with the landowner's permission. And he agreed that he would not harvest in that area at all during the period of our study. But that's what it took for us to find a place that we actually could study. We did find one before, but the owner of that land was convinced that all we needed to use in our study was 10 plants. And of course, statistically, 10 plants says nothing. But we did get through 8 years. So we got some good data out of it and some good papers. But this is one of our challenges, though. Since things do take so long, and if poachers are coming in and stealing plants from a field, and you don't know they've been there, and you're, say, giving and it's a field about, and you're giving it your 8 or 10 or however many years you're letting elapse. If somebody's come in there after like year 4 or 5, you won't have any way of knowing that they've been there, except there's going to be a surprisingly less peyote there than you'd anticipated. And so the only way around this would be total regulation of harvesting. And there's just no way you can do that. There's no way you could keep track of which harvesters went on which parcel and nobody else went there, and make sure that everything's cycling through. And I mean, would you be doing like allotments to determine which distributors got to access which pieces of land? I mean, it would just really rapidly become a bureaucratic headache and nightmare to try to address that. I mean, that's one reason I think, IPCI is doing good things, is they're trying to work out these questions, and they're trying to work them out on the ground in a way that's real. And they're trying to work them out in a way that's actually acceptable to traditional people. And so it's going to be a little messy. And so, I've heard people get critical of, what they see as deficiencies, but I really believe that we should reserve our judgment until we've seen what actually has been the result. I wish them nothing but success, because they're really the only game in town as far as Native American church cultivation goes. There's other Native American church groups that are cultivating, but it's all tiny scale, and most of them are doing it secretly. And it's just some year we can have a better conversation on this.
Yeah, no,
But we're still in a bumpy point.
It's very complex. It sounds like a mix of cultivation and I guess, as you sort of say, you have to have local knowledge, and local knowledge playing by the rules for this really to work. Because it sounds like
good luck with that one. That's because this is the challenge, because you've got competing interests, people who need the peyote for their ceremonies have their own motivations and challenges. And the people who are trying to provide for that, um, they're up against a diminishing returns here in the US. And so some bad behavior is to be expected, because we're seeing people getting pushed into, more of a state of desperation, because it's the problem when you have a church that's based on a sacrament that's perishable and in short supply. When the peyote disappears, does the church disappear? And if not, how not? It's like a lot of people say, oh, they should be in San Pedro. But the reality is, Trichocereus are not peyote. The effects are not the same. There's about 5 alkaloids in peyote that are present in physiologically active amounts. And when you ingest peyote, you're having a synergy of this handful of alkaloids. This happens with, other cactus too, but the alkaloids are very different. Like on San Pedro or Peruvianus or Macrogonus, it's much more similar to a pure mescaline experience than a peyote experience, because it doesn't have, like lophophorine and peyote in them. And as far as I know, no Trichocereus has those 2 alkaloids in it. So it's just, it's definitely a multi-layered and complex picture. I just wish I had I wish I had answers to the challenges, but I think we all needed to be maybe 50 years younger or something, or asking these questions, 30 years ago, and getting engaged in what's happening now, decades earlier. But I haven't mastered time travel.
Ecologically, these are very challenging times, and the natural habitat of the peyote plant is no exception. It's under threat. However, it seems that the peyote does have a message it would like to pass on to us, but we don't all have the luxury of having that message. If we all tried peyote and kept trying peyote, it simply wouldn't be there anymore.
That's the other thing that's problematic, is that so many people seem to think that just ingesting a molecule has intrinsic value. And I don't know. I personally don't. I think it's, do we do something with it? What do we gain from it? Do we come back with personal growth? Do we come back with some aspect of our something that improves our lives and enhances our relationships with other people? Those are the things that actually matter, not taking a drug.
Yes, I feel it's about taking the positive from the experience, but not overdoing it so that there's not really any learning or benefit. I guess an example is like taking mushrooms the first 1 or 2 times really does help many people understand the environment better and bring us close to nature. But maybe taking mushrooms another 65 times only enhances that a very small proportion.
Yeah.
It's
exactly. Yeah. And yeah, it's a interesting thing, because a lot of people will say, oh, my use of these molecules has really given me a greater appreciation of the environment, and it's, turned me against nuclear energy. And I believe that this is a lot of people's experience. It was mine. But at the same time, I actually met somebody who was convinced that, LSD and other molecules were the secret to helping him design better guidance systems for cruise missiles. And so, how people apply it is all over the board.
In strictly a US context, I'm wondering how much underground usage there is of the peyote cactus outside of the Native American church.
Almost none. It depends on the vantage point of the person asking that question. But as far as like what you're asking about, it's almost none. There's very little peyote on the black market, for drug users, and it's always been that way, because the reality is most people don't like eating peyote. Most people would prefer to eat a gram or two of mushrooms rather than a quarter pound of, fresh peyote plants. It's just it's easier on the system. It's easier to get down. And compare that with, like dropping 100 mics of acid. It's that's what or that's why most Westerners are not going to opt for peyote, and that's why it's not in the drug market, is because there is no demand for it. There's individuals that will demand are interested, but those individuals are going to seek it out and find it themselves, or they'll find some, culturally suitable surrogate for it if they're from a Western culture, like San Pedro or something like that. It's just, but most people just don't like the taste. They don't like weathering through the first couple hours, and so it's never going to be a big drug of abuse, no matter, it gets lumped in that term because it's active and there are people who have an interest in it. But even pure mescaline, it doesn't have that big of a fan base compared to other molecules.
I guess in part that's because it's a rare cactus and also quite a challenge to prepare for some people. I guess what about other peyote using groups that aren't part of the Native American church?
Here's where we get into a weird area, which is other peyote using groups. And there's some in the US, but there's way more in Mexico and South America. It's not clear exactly how many there are. There's at least half a dozen of them, a couple of which are actually quite sizable. Like, Camino Rojo operates, I think it's like 19 different countries around the world. And of course, they also use ayahuasca in addition to peyote. Sometimes they'll use them together in the same ceremonies. Sometimes they'll use them together in the same ceremonies in a sweat lodge. Um, so everybody's got their own ideas. And then you've got this thing here in the US called the Native American Church of Oclavuejo, with James Flaming Eagle Mooney, which is an all-race church. And the Native American church largely hates them, absolutely hates them, because they believe they're going to be eating all their peyote. And so there's this very weird dynamic that's going on, because they don't have protection from the congressional action, but they actually made it through the Utah Supreme Court level and found that they were supported by the Utah Supreme Court. And what we've been seeing in the wake of this is DEA has sort of gone, whoa, shit, we've just lost 3 fights. One with the Santo Daimes, one with the União de Vegetal, now with these people. And so I've noticed they're picking and choosing their fights way more carefully, because they can't afford to keep losing them due to the precedents that establishes. And like in this particular one, they could have challenged that Utah decision, in which case it would have got bumped up to the Supreme Court for deliberation, where it might well have lost. But DEA was unwilling to take that chance. And so, so there's this, weird undercurrents, but it also means we don't actually know how many peyote using organizations there are, especially if you're counting, outside the US. I started doing a survey a few years ago just to try to get an idea of it, and it shot over 600 groups that are, basically doing ceremony work around peyote. That's including Native American church. And of course, like Oclabuehu, they're claiming they got 200 chapters, and I could not find anywhere near that. And so we've also got, this element where how much is showmanship to make people look bigger or make people look smaller. Like with, Native American church, when you're hearing talks involving membership, what you'll often find is it sort of is presented as something that's sort of smallish, and the number that gets tossed around will be like, 100,000 or 250,000 or 225,000. These are the most common numbers to hear. But that 250,000 has been getting kicked around unchanged since about 1959. And very clearly, the membership has grown dramatically. And so the larger numbers tend to get used if they're wanting to present it as having, more clout in terms of people. The smaller numbers tend to get used if they're wanting to make it look like there's fewer people involved with it. I mean, that was why the court ruled the way they did with the Unia de Vegetal, was they're saying, oh, it's just a few people, and our ruling only affects these few people. And they went on to say that they would come back and revisit it in the future if they're proved to have problems. But the world of ayahuasca seemed to take that and run with it as if it had just been made legal. And in retrospect, that was a really smart thing, because if you take that approach and nothing happens to you, you're essentially setting up the picture so it is de facto legal for you, and that nobody's going to bother you for it. I think that's really promising, frankly, because those are the times when you can actually get some real change and growth happening. It's not when we're having good times that there's the best opportunities. It's when we're having really bad times. So maybe moving into these next few years here, while everybody is so busy dealing with other things, we can achieve something and be left alone, because the people who would normally be opposing us have their hands full elsewhere.
Well, thank you so much for chatting. It's been
wonderful.
Great.
Thank you for joining us for this interview. Before you go, I just wanted to add one footnote. I just want to point out one important study relevant to this conversation from a more global perspective. The paper is called Mescaline, Peyote, and San Pedro. Is sustainability important for cactus customers? The authors are Liam Ingalls, Monica Barrett, Jason Ferris, and some others. The paper can be found in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies in Volume 7, Issue 2. The study is taking a look at the consumption of mescaline worldwide, rather than focusing in on just Texas and Mexico, which is primarily what we were covering in this video. I'll place a link to the paper in the YouTube information below this video.